Candy Hilton. I'm the house manager at Grace House Akron, and today we are going to be discussing Module 7 of our Caregiver Certification Training, which is on loss and bereavement. The reason that this discussion is so profound and important is not only for you professionally as a caregiver to understand how to better care for residents and family members as they are grieving, but also for yourself. Because just like the old adage, you can't help others if you can't help yourself first. So just to start, we're gonna go over just a few definitions, because I know sometimes people may say these words but not really understand or know exactly what the differences are. So with grief, this would explain a person's response to a loss, and loss can be anything. It can be the loss of a loved one, it can be the loss of a home, it can be the loss of an animal, a pet. So it's not just strictly the loss of or a death of someone. So that is a multifaceted response to loss, particularly to the loss of someone or something to which a bond was formed. That has physical, cognitive, behavioral, social dimensions. So basically it's saying that it affects all aspects of a person's being. Mourning, M-O-U-R-N-I-N-G, is the outward expression of that loss. So how it manifests, how it looks for each person may be different. Bereavement would be the situation of having experienced the death of a loved one. So many times you'll see hospice services offer bereavement follow-up upon the death of one of their clients for the family members. So loss is experienced by the patient in and of itself. Like, there's changes that occur in the body as they get closer to that dying process, or in that dying process, and those are loss that they truly feel and experience, even though they are going into the dying stage. So changes in their body, their loss of ability to do many of the things that they were able to do at one point in time, so to fulfill the roles that they may have had, loss of relationships, and then loss of life. I can't imagine what that would feel like to know that you're dying and that your life, like you're losing your life. So that's a huge loss for patients that we should keep in mind. And then for their loved ones, loss of hopes for future with their loved one that is dying, loss of their own activities during their caregiving. If they're the primary caregiver, a lot of things they have to put on the back burner because they have to take care of that loved one. So all of that could be seen as a loss. Grief is a natural human response to any loss. It's very personal. I always say that it's not going to look the same for each person, even if one individual may have the death of a mother or a spouse. It may look different how that person grieves versus someone else who's lost a mom or a spouse. There is no right or wrong way to grieve. Grief is profound. It affects all levels of one's being. So some things that people may do as far as coping behaviors, that would be what they do to help ease their pain of that grief. So some of those things may not be as healthy as others, but point in fact is still something that would be done or seen. So they may withdraw, they may have passivity, expression of feelings, they may have avoidance where they're just avoiding everything and everybody, distractions, like doing things to distract them from being able to process their feelings, rationalization, confrontation, may become very angry, blame of self or others, physical release. And it's to really understand that grieving takes time. So the time frame that someone grieves may be different person to person. It may not be the same. Grief just doesn't go away. If it's ignored, it can be destructive, because to me, it's almost like a pressure cooker. If you just keep putting things in and not dealing with them, at some point the top is going to pop. Those are things to consider with grief. There are different types of grief. So the first is anticipatory grief, and this occurs when death is approaching or expected. So those days and weeks, sometimes months ahead of somebody actually dying, a family member, or even the patient, him or herself, may experience this anticipatory grief, knowing that this is something that's impending, that's going to happen. Doesn't necessarily lessen the grief that occurs at the time of death. So just because a person may experience anticipatory grief, it does not necessarily mean that that will take their grief away at the time of death. And then the second is disenfranchised grief. This is grief not recognized or accepted by others. So they may not think, why are you grieving? Like, other people may look at you and say, well, why are you grieving? That could be ex-spouses, stepchildren, the LGBTQ community, and those bereaved by suicide, or things that may hold stigmas within the community when people overdose or have like a chronic illness like AIDS. And I'll just give a personal story. I went through several miscarriages when my husband and I were trying to conceive and have kids, start a family. And I will never forget some of my own family members, because I miscarried so early on in the pregnancies, the two different times. And they said, well, maybe you shouldn't just say anything about being pregnant, because I let everybody know I was pregnant. I didn't wait the whole first trimester before I said anything. And I don't believe in superstition, so I didn't think that was a need for me to wait. And they said, maybe next time just don't say anything, like that was the reason why I miscarried. And then I don't think anybody could really understand my grief, because they said, well, at least you didn't have the baby. You know, it didn't get to that point where you had the baby. And I'm like, it doesn't matter at what point in time you have that you know you're pregnant. That connection and just knowing that you're pregnant, that was my baby. So that disenfranchised grief, like, I went through a lot of moments feeling so alone, because nobody really could validate my feelings. So complicated grief is a type of grief that can be intense, lasting longer than a year. And for that's when you start to see that it's interfering with the day-to-day functioning of a person. So they're saying greater than 6 months. So if it's lasting longer than a year, then that is a complicated type grief. Chronic grief would be, it continues for a long period. Maybe that person is unable to return to normal activities of day-to-day, like activities that they have to do on a day-to-day basis. Delayed grief, not expressed at the time of loss. Other events that requires time and energy, so postponed, inhibited, or suppressed. So these things can just not be at the time, but then they come up later on and maybe come out sideways. Exaggerated grief is severe reactions. People may have nightmares or feel extreme guilt, fear, self-destructive behavior. Masked grief, reactions such as depression or anger, but one doesn't connect the reactions to the loss. So they may just be having all of these feelings, but not really realizing that they're really dealing with their grief, and it's coming out again sideways. And then sudden grief brought on by someone's death as a result of murder, suicide, a military death, an accident like a traumatic event, difficulty accepting the reality of the loss. just for some examples, has there been any personal or professional things that you've run across that maybe fit into these categories?
Yes, I think I can speak to one on perhaps sudden grief. So one of my roles within my life is working as an academic advisor at Kent State. And once in a while, we'll have the unfortunate experience of getting a death notice for a student. And so keep in mind, for traditional college students, they're between 17 and 21 usually. So these are typically folks, families and friends aren't expecting them to pass away.
Right.
So it typically is due to some traumatic incident. So surrounding that, I've noticed it can be a complicated, sudden, and intense grief for friends and family and other students.
That's a good point. I think that's a really good example. I think when I think about when someone within that are younger, like in the K through 12 realm, they always say, you know, we have counselors on staff. So in the university level, do they normally offer assistance for students or staff that may be dealing with that sudden grief?
That's a good question. So I would assume all institutions do it a little bit differently. At least at Kent State, there is, like the widespread counseling and psychological services that you can utilize. And then they also have a counseling mental health program with master's students, so you can go and see them. That's a little more flexy. But I don't know that they put any sort of initiative out there for the general student or staff population.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. I think that's something even here at Grace House that I know we probably have staffing that would be of assistance, like even you, Dr. Jones, to talk to our staff. But, you know, for some of our residents that have been here for an extended amount of time, we just had a recent one. And although we all knew that it was getting to that point, I think just the fact of it happening, it kind of still threw everybody for a loop, just like, oh my goodness, like this is real, this happened. So I think having someone that staff can maybe talk to or express those feelings and just help them process and deal with it, I think would be really good. But it is good that we still have people like on the spiritual advisory committee that I'm sure would be able to be and fill in that gap for our staff. That's a real thing. So some common responses to grief, definitely physical, cognitive, emotional, behavioral, and spiritual. So really all aspects of your being can come out in those responses. So the things that sometimes affect grief that some people may not realize, the type of relationship that they may have had with that person, the type of death, where and how. If there's been previous losses, like I have so many examples, like personal examples, but when I think about like my brother died unexpectedly at 50, and then 11 months later, my dad died. And so he had been sick, and he ended up being on hospice care, but those multiple deaths, like back to back, sometimes can cause the grieving process to be a little more intense. Characteristics of the bereaved, like age, gender, personality, cultural background, spiritual beliefs, social support that may be available, and if there's any other stressors that may be from different areas of a person's life on top of them grieving their loved one, are all things that could affect that grief. So there's a couple grief theories, and this is just to make mention of it so that you're aware. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who pretty much is the person that instituted like hospice care, has a grief theory on death and dying, and then William Worden has one on task of grief work. Is there anything on those that you may know of that you would like to add in this? I would just say this is something just to be more aware of, that these are things that are in existence. Go ahead.
I'm glad you brought up a few different theories. I think it's helpful to draw from multiple theories, because I think when we focus too keenly on one very sequential line of grief or dying, we can lose sight that there's an ebb and a flow, there's a going back to, there is a work, right? So it's more complicated than steps, but they're all very
Agreed.
helpful to look back to.
Agreed. Like that. So here, the stages that Kubler-Ross goes through is DABDA. D for denial of the illness or death. A is for anger at God, maybe even the healthcare providers or other loved ones or themselves. B would be for bargaining with God or other people. D, depression reflected in hopelessness and withdrawal. And A, for acceptance of reality of the illness or the death. So we kind of talked about this, I think it was in the last module, those stages of death, but this kind of gives you a little acronym that you can remember. Warden task. So the first task would be accepting the reality of the loss. 2 would be experiencing the pain of the loss. 3, adjusting to life without the loved one. So adjusting to that environment in which the deceased is missing. I know a lot of times, I've said it myself, but I've heard other people say you go through that stage where you want to reach out and call that loved one, and then you remember, oh my goodness, no, they're no longer here. Like, it's just, you're so used to being able to do something like that. So that adjustment to life without the person that passed away. And then finding a way to remember the loved one who died, to emotionally relocate the deceased and be able to move on with your life. So those are he refers to them as tasks instead of stages. So there are some things to consider when you're thinking of children in grief. Children respond a lot differently. They respond to loss according to their maturity level. So, of course, babies like birth to 9 months, they may notice changes in different things like the schedule, or they pick up on feelings that we may not think because, oh, they're so little, but they do. They pick up on things and feelings of people around them. Babies 10 months to 2 years, they may sense mood of others and the absence of certain things, like people that may have been key providers to them, if it's somebody close to them, like a parent or something, or even grandparents. Children 2 to 5 years, they see death as temporary, like they think that the person is going to come back. They're concrete. What's told to them is actual truth. They may think of the deceased as just sleeping instead of them actually being dead. So, and then children 6 to 9, they see death more as final. They may feel some responsibility for the death or experience sadness, anger, or fear. Pre-adolescents 10 to 12 years, they see death as permanent, and they understand that person is not just sleeping, that it will happen to themselves. They start to see, okay, this is something that's a part of life, especially if you have, and you're giving them that information as they're growing up, that death is a part of life. And they're able to understand rituals of death, especially depending on the culture that they're growing up in. Adolescents 13 to 19 years, they understand death as an adult, may become depressed and withdrawn if that occurs, especially if it's someone close to them, like a parent or grandparent. They have an emotional development period in their lives. This is pretty profound for them. Helping grieving children. I'm a proponent of this. Be honest and keep it simple, but be honest. I don't think not telling a child that this is what's happened is going to make matters better. I think that it just will cause for more issues down the line. You do want to kind of do it on their developmental level, but being honest and simple. Never lie to a child to being the story, and it builds up over time. Provide a calm, nurturing presence for babies. Hold and comfort them. And I think that's true even as a child is a little bit older. Holding them, comforting them, using words like death, died, instead of gone or sleeping. And I think that's part of that honesty. Maintain the child's schedule and routine as much as possible. Telling children what to expect. Reassuring them that the death was not their fault, and encouraging them to be able to express their feelings and talk about memories. And I think that's true even though we don't have children as residents here at Grace House. We do have family members that have a lot of children that come through. So I think as caregivers, being able to take some of this information and apply it, and it may not be all of this, but using those words like death, like dying, that they're not just sleeping, and being honest and using those simple terms would be helpful. Again, this is more information, making sure that children are involved in the process of, because that helps them to start to grieve, I think, as well. And maybe they don't know what they're feeling, but it'll help them to start identifying their feelings and being able to hopefully start processing them. Allow children to participate in any death rituals, encouraging time off from grieving. Sometimes the art and music is helpful, I think, for anyone, a child or an adult, to deal with the grieving process. And if grief response severely affects functioning, of course, that would need to go to a professional for help. But I think just us having this information, because it may be family members that come to us and ask, well, my child is having a hard time. What ways, do you have any recommendations of ways that I can help he or she to process and work through? So I touched on this a little bit, just a little bit ago, and I think as caregivers, the first thing, and I know it's not on here, is the first thing or point on this is saying take care of yourself, which is completely true. I think in that is allowing yourself to feel what you're feeling at that moment. It is okay. Understand your feelings and reactions around death. I think that's different for everyone, especially if you've had traumatic death experiences with other loved ones in your family or friends. Really, truly understanding what those feelings you have around death are. Recognize your own grief as you work with the families, because you may be feeling grief too. It may be anticipatory. It may be way before the death occurs. Do not burden the family with one's own grief. So no, we're not saying that you unleash and kind of ignore what grief the family is having, but do recognize yours, because it may be something that as the house manager or Holly as the director, we can help you process through. Talk with your coworkers, ask for help. We have an EAP program, employee assistance program, that offers assistance for things quite like this. Involve yourself in ritual and support groups. Time to get away. If you need to step away, it may be that you need to take a day off. I don't know. But it may be that you just need to step away from your responsibilities at that point in time at work and just take 5 minutes. Watch out for negative coping like eating, alcohol, drug use, exhaustion. If you're highly stressed or anxious, then it may be that you have to seek more support from us, either myself or Holly. How do you help the grieving adult? Things that you can say: I'm sorry about your loss. Tell me about your loved one. What I remember about your loved one is blank, blank, blank. Things that probably would not be helpful to say: I know how you feel, because how you feel or how you felt about someone's loss, the loss of a loved one in your own economy may be different than what that person may be feeling. Things like God needed your loved one in heaven. This was God's plan. You will get over this. Don't try to make them feel better by saying things like cheer up, and don't give advice. So those are things to kind of keep in mind when you're dealing with grieving family members. I think listening is a big thing. It doesn't always mean that you have to say anything. I think just the presence, your presence, being there and allowing them to emote is probably one of the biggest gifts that you can give a person that may be grieving. It's okay if it's silent. I know it feels uncomfortable for us because we want to fill in those blanks and say something, but just allow that person to feel what they're feeling. Arrange for loved ones to be with the body. So when we make the calls to hospice and hospice makes the calls to the family members and family comes, just in that time that it takes them to get here, make sure that the resident's body is presentable, so that when they come, they can see that person as they remembered them and not feel grossed out by anything. Encourage expression of feelings. Feelings are okay. Share memories. Respond to requests for help. It's not always the most helpful to say, let me know what I can do. Just do things. Just do the things that you know may be helpful. Call or connect with the griever in days and months ahead. And I know that's something that our bereavement, that they're starting to institute with the volunteers doing bereavement. Calls like our bereavement program will include that, and sending a card. We don't always get to attend funerals and express condolences in that way, but I know a lot of times, we do a memorial service twice a year, which gives us an opportunity to be able to see families and friends of that loved one, resident that passed away here, and we can offer those condolences. Just in summary, just remembering that grief is a person's response to loss. Normal responses to grief will include physical, emotional, cognitive, behavioral, social, and spiritual. So holistically, you will grieve. Grief is unique and personal for each of us. There's no right or wrong way to grieve. Realize that you experience your own grief when caring for people who are dying. That's a huge piece that you really have to keep in mind. And grieving takes time and effort. It's not something that you just rush through, and it's going to be a different time frame for one person compared to another person. Grief just doesn't go away. If ignored, it can be destructive. And remember that many community grief resources are available for families and our staff. So with that said, that is the end of this module. There will be a quiz that will be sent to you along with the video. If you have any questions or concerns, please don't hesitate to reach out to me. Thank you.